The grand obsidian chamber of the High Synod vibrated, not with the mechanical thrum of engines, but with the visceral, bone-deep resonance of a civilization screaming in its death throes. The air within the vast amphitheater was stale, recycled too many times, tasting of ozone and terror. Above the tiered seating, where representatives of 1,000 star systems sat in varying states of biological distress, the holoweave projected the nightmare in real time. It was a cartography of extinction. Great swathes of the galaxy, once bright with the digital signatures of the Kyraxi trade routes and the Authari sanctuaries, were now simply dead zones. The darkness was expanding. It was not a void. It was a hungry, creeping absence of data, a silence that followed the screaming. The Devourers, a species without a name in any civilized tongue, referred to only by the outcome of their arrival, were pushing the joint fleets of the galactic Concordat back toward the galactic core. The strategy meetings had dissolved into panics days ago. Now, the High Synod was less a war room and more awake for the living. High Counselor Zalker of the warrior caste Vrak stood at the center of the obsidian floor, his chitinous armor cracked from a battle he had barely survived a rotation ago. His mandibles clicked in a rhythm of suppressed rage, his 4 eyes scanning the terrified faces of the assembly. He pointed a trembling claw at the one sector of the map that remained untouched by the war, a solitary bubble of space near the Orion arm that the Devourers had, for reasons beyond computation, completely ignored. It was a region of space that appeared on the tactical displays as a calm blue sphere amidst a sea of violent crimson. "They do nothing," Zalker hissed, his voice amplified by the acoustic architecture of the chamber booming like thunder over the gathered diplomats. "The outer colonies burn, the great shipyards of Antares are dust. We sacrifice our young by the millions to buy mere hours of survival, and they sit there. They sit in their gravity wells, sipping their liquids, watching the stars go out one by one. They do not answer hails, they do not mobilize fleets, they do not fortify their borders. They simply exist, quiet, unconcerned, as if the apocalypse were a play performed for their amusement." The counselor slammed his fist onto the tactical table, shattering the holographic projection of the losing front line. "The humans, the Terran Union, they are either cowards of the highest order or they are complicit in this slaughter. I demand we breach their silence. If they will not fight for the living, let us drag the war to their doorstep and force them to bleed with the rest of us." A murmur of assent rippled through the chamber, fueled by desperation. But from the shadows of the upper tiers, a softer, more melodic voice cut through the clamor. It was Matriarch Alara of the Psionic Ascendancy, her tall, slender form draped in robes that shimmered with the shifting colors of a nebula. She floated down toward the center floor, her movement defying gravity, her presence commanding an immediate, fearful silence. She was old, ancient enough to remember the cycles before the Concordat, and her eyes held the weight of 1,000 tragedies. "You speak of dragging war to them, Zalker," she said, her telepathic projection echoing in the minds of every being present, translating instantly into their native cognitive frameworks. "You speak of force. Do you forget why the Devourers avoid that sector? Do you forget why, for 3,000 standard cycles, no trade ship has entered Terran space and returned with anything other than polite refusal? We do not know them. We know only their silence. And in the history of the cosmos, silence is often more dangerous than the loudest cannon." The debate raged for hours, a cyclic argument of fear versus curiosity, aggression versus caution. The Concordat was dying. The logic of the desperate prevailed. If the humans possessed technology or resources that could stem the tide of the Devourers, the Concordat had to seize it or beg for it. Doing nothing was death. Provoking the silent giants might be death, but it offered a sliver of probability for salvation. A decision was made, etched into the desperate history of the Council. A diplomatic task force, escorted by the remnants of the Vrak Grand Fleet, a collection of scarred dreadnoughts and jury-rigged carriers, would travel to the Terran exclusion zone. They would demand an audience. They would demand aid. And if the humans refused, they would bring the reality of the war to the quiet paradise the Terran species seemed to inhabit. As the fleet assembled, jumping away from the burning wreckage of the border worlds, the mood was not one of hope, but of grim fatalism. They were marching to the door of a hermit god, hoping he was benevolent, but fearing he was simply a monster who liked to sleep. The journey to the Terran border was a study eye. And psychological deterioration. As the Concordat fleet engaged their warp drives, leaving the screaming frequencies of the war zone behind, the silence of the void began to press in on the crews. Usually, subspace was filled with the chatter of buoys, the distant echoes of commerce, the navigational pings of a busy galaxy. But as they approached the coordinates of the human sphere, the noise vanished. The background radiation seemed to smooth out. The chaotic quantum foam that usually battered Hull shields calmed into a pristine, unnatural stillness. It was as if the chaotic laws of physics that governed the rest of the galaxy were being politely asked to behave. Zalker stood on the bridge of the flagship Iron Will, watching the sensor readouts with growing unease. There were no mines, no automated defense platforms, no patrols. The Terran border was not a wall, it was a threshold. "Status report," Zalker barked, the silence unnerving him more than the roar of plasma fire ever could. The sensor officer, a cybernetically enhanced Grell whose logic circuits were usually infallible, looked up from his console with an expression of biological confusion. "High Counselor, we are detecting nothing. No active scans, no targeting locks. However, the navigational computer is correcting our course automatically. We are not steering the ship anymore. Something is guiding us." Panic flared on the bridge. Weapons officers reached for firing keys, but the controls were unresponsive. Not locked, just dormant, as if the ship itself had decided that violence was inappropriate. The massive fleet weapons of war designed to crack continents glided forward in a perfect, forced formation, drawn into the Terran system like leaves caught in a gentle, inevitable current. They dropped out of warp not at the edge of the system, but directly in orbit of the primary world, Earth. The transition was seamless, lacking the usual nausea-inducing lurch of real space re-entry. The view that greeted the weary warriors and desperate diplomats was shocking in its tranquility. The planet below was a jewel of vibrant blues and greens, shrouded in swirling white clouds. There was no orbital ring of steel, no crisscrossing lattice of defense satellites, no bustling traffic of heavy freighters. There were only a few silver spires floating in high orbit, rotating slowly, reflecting the light of the yellow sun. They looked less like stations and more like art installations, monuments to geometry and light. The sheer audacity of it struck Zalker like a physical blow. The galaxy was burning. Entire species were being processed into biomass by the Devourers. And here the humans maintained a garden, unguarded, unblemished, arrogantly exposed. "We are being hailed," the communications officer whispered, the fear evident in his voice. "Audio only, no encryption, no digital handshake." Zalker straightened his carapace, preparing for a threat, a demand, a warning. He signaled for the channel to be opened. The voice that filled the bridge was not the harsh, synthesized bark of a military commander, nor the slick, deceptive tone of a politician. It was a voice of gravel and honey, old and weary, yet possessed of a terrifying stability. "Welcome to Sol," the voice said. "We were wondering when the noise would finally arrive. You may descend. Shuttle Bay 3 on the orbital Spire Zenith. Please leave your weapons on your ships. You will not need them, and they are terribly heavy to carry." The delegation that descended to the Spire consisted of Zalker, Matriarch Alara, and a handful of the Concordat's finest xenobiologists and tacticians. They expected a fortress. They expected guards in power armor. They stepped out of the airlock into a hall of glass and light, where the floor seemed to be made of polished water and the walls were transparent, offering a panoramic view of the blue world below. There were no guards. There were no security scanners. The air smelled of rain and old paper. Waiting for them at the end of the hall, sitting in a simple chair made of wood, actual organic wood, a luxury worth a planetary governor's ransom in the Concordat, sat a human. He was male, his hair the color of steel wool, his face lined with the cartography of a long life. He wore simple robes of gray fabric, unadorned by badges of rank or military honors. He held a ceramic cup in his hands, from which steam curled lazily into the air. He did not stand. He did not bow. He simply watched them approach with eyes that were dark, deep, and utterly unconcerned. "I am High Counselor Zalker of the United Concordat," the Vrak warrior announced, his voice booming in the quiet hall. He felt foolish, like a child shouting in a library. "We come on behalf of the Galactic Council. We come in the hour of our greatest need. The galaxy is dying, human, and you sit here drinking, whatever that is, while the Devourers consume us all." The human took a sip from his cup, savoring the flavor before placing it gently on a small side table. He looked at Zalker, then at Alara, his gaze lingering on the matriarch with a hint of sadness. "It is tea," the human said softly. "Earl Grey, a blend from a region on the surface called India. It helps one think. And we know who you are, High Counselor. We know of the Devourers. We have watched their progress since they emerged from the void between galaxies." "You watched?" Zalker stepped forward, his anger overriding his diplomatic training. "You watched as the Authari system was purged. You watched as the nursery worlds of the Krell were burned. You have the audacity to admit this. If you saw it, why did you not act? Where are your fleets? Where are your warriors? We see your world, fat and happy, untouched by the horrors we face. Do you possess no honor, no empathy?" The human sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. He gestured to the empty chairs arranged in a semicircle before him. Sit, please. Standing requires energy you can ill afford to waste. You are tired, Zalker. Your biology is flooded with stress hormones. You are slowly dying of exhaustion. Reluctantly confused by the lack of defensive posturing, the delegation sat. The chairs adjusted instantly to their varied anatomies, providing a comfort that was almost unnerving. Matriarch Alara leaned forward, her mind probing gently, trying to read the human's intentions. She hit a wall, not a psionic shield which felt like static or steel, but a void. The human's mind was like a deep ocean. She could see the surface, but the depths were impenetrable, vast, and silent. I cannot read you, she whispered, her eyes widening. You are not shielded, you are simply dense. We have had a long time to learn control, Matriarch, the human said, nodding to her. I am Ambassador Thorn, though ambassador is a loose term. I am merely the one whose turn it is to sit in the chair and answer the door. Enough riddles, Zalker snapped. We need your help. The Devourers are endless. They adapt to our weapons. They consume our energy. We are told you are an ancient species, one that predates the Concordat. If you have technology, give it to us. If you have ships, launch them. If you refuse, the Concordat will have no choice but to consider the Terran Union a hostile entity hoarding resources essential for galactic survival. Thorn looked at the Vrak warrior, his expression shifting from mild boredom to a sharp, penetrating intensity. The air in the room seemed to drop in temperature. Hostile, Thorn repeated, testing the word. You threaten us with war here in this place? He leaned back, crossing his legs. Zalker, you assume we are quiet because we are hiding. You assume we do not fight because we are afraid or because we are selfish. You look at our lack of fleets and see weakness. This is a fundamental error in translation. Then correct the error, Alara interposed, sensing the dangerous spike in Zalker's aggression. Explain it to us. The Devourers destroy everything they touch. Why are you unconcerned? Are you immune? Thorn stood up slowly. He walked to the transparent wall, looking down at the clouds of earth. Immune? No, flesh burns, metal melts. We are made of the same matter as you. But you ask why we do not fight the Devourers. The answer is simple. We do not fight them because they are not the enemy. They are the immune system. The silence that followed was absolute. The delegates exchanged glances of horror and confusion. Immune system? Zalker asked, his voice trembling with suppressed violence. They kill billions, they eat stars. Yes, Thorn said, turning back to face them. They eat the noise, they consume the chaos. They are attracted to high-energy discharges, to the warping of space-time caused by excessive FTL travel, to the psionic screaming of civilizations at war. The galaxy is sick, counselors. It has a fever. The Devourers are the white blood cells sent to burn out the infection. He walked back to his chair, but did not sit. He loomed over them, his presence suddenly filling the room, feeling far larger than his physical frame. And you, with your constant wars, your expanding empires, your reckless tearing of the subspace fabric, you are the virus. Zalker roared, leaping to his feet, his hand reaching for a sidearm that he had been forced to leave on the ship. You call us a disease? We fight for survival. We build. We explore. You consume, Thorn corrected, his voice hard as diamond. You expand without thought. You wage war over resources you do not need. You have forgotten the first rule of the sentient. Silence is survival. Thorn waved his hand, and the room darkened. A holographic projection appeared in the center of the circle. It showed the galaxy, but not as the Concordat knew it. It showed the flows of energy, the stressed lines in reality. Look at your empires, bright, burning scars on the skin of the universe. Now look. At Sol, the Terran sector was a void in the map, a patch of calm, stable reality. We learned this lesson 10,000 years ago. We almost destroyed ourselves. We almost woke the dark, so we stopped. We put away our fleets. We dismantled our starforges. We turned inward. We learned to live within our means, to travel without tearing the sky, to communicate without screaming into the void. The Devourers, Alara whispered, the realization dawning on her with the force of a supernova. They don't attack you because you are quiet. Precisely, Thorn said. We are the species that sits quietly. We do not ripple the water, therefore the sharks do not see us. Then teach us, Zalker pleaded, his anger turning to desperation. Show us how to hide. If we stop the wars, if we power down the fleets, will they leave? Thorn looked at the Vrak warrior with profound pity. It is too late for you, Zalker. The Devourers have your scent. Once the immune response is triggered, it does not stop until the pathogen is eliminated. You cannot hide now. You have been screaming for too long. Then you condemn us to death, Alara cried, tears streaming down her face. You sit in your paradise and watch us die, justifying it with philosophy. That is not wisdom, human, that is cruelty. Thorn's eyes hardened. We are not watching you die, we are waiting. Waiting for what? For the devourers to finish their meal, Thorn said coldly. Or for you to prove that you are worth saving, that you are not just a virus but a life form capable of symbiosis. The tension in the room broke as alarms began to blare on the Concordat communicators. The devourers had found them. A splinter fleet of the swarm, tracking the massive warp signature of the diplomatic task force, had just entered the Sol system. The sensors on the iron will screamed warnings. The sky above the orbital spire darkened as thousands of bioships, massive, fleshy constructs of bone and hatred, blocked out the sun. The Concordat fleet in orbit opened fire, their plasma batteries lighting up the darkness. But it was futile. The devourers swarmed over the dreadnoughts, tearing through hull plating, consuming the energy of the shields. They are here, Zalker shouted. You fool, you led them here, your silence is broken, now you will die with us. Thorn did not flinch. He did not look at the sky. He looked at his watch, an antique analog device on his wrist. On time, he muttered. They are always so predictable. Do something, Ilara screamed, watching the holofeed as her own escort ships were torn apart. You said you were powerful, you said you learned, fight them. Thorn walked over to the console that controlled the spire's environmental systems. He placed his hand on a single, unadorned glass panel. We do not fight, matriarch, I told you. Fighting creates noise. Fighting feeds them. He looked at the aliens, his expression shifting to one of grim determination. You asked for a demonstration of human power. You asked why we are unconcerned. Watch. Thorn pressed his hand into the glass. He didn't fire a weapon. He didn't launch a fleet. He spoke a single word into the comms system, a command that went out not on radio waves, but through a medium the Concordat scientists couldn't even identify, a resonance that traveled through the subatomic lattice of reality itself. Hush! The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Across the Sol system, the laws of physics seemed to solidify. The chaotic energy that powered the devourer ships, the biological reactions, the plasma drives, the neural synapses of the hive mind simply ceased to function. It wasn't an EMP. It was a stasis field of absolute order. The devourer ships didn't explode, they just stopped. They drifted inert, their biological fires snuffed out. The Concordat ships, too, lost power, their reactors dampening to a low hum, their weapons offline. The screaming of the war, the explosions, the panic, all of it was silenced in a heartbeat. The sky above the spire was filled with the drifting carcasses of the enemy fleet, frozen in place like insects trapped in amber. The silence that fell over the room was heavier than a neutron star. Zalker fell to his knees, his mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. What did you do? We imposed order, Thorn said, his voice sounding tired, as if the act had drained him physically. We expanded the exclusion zone. We projected our local reality, our silence outward. In our space, kinetic energy is capped. High-energy reactions are dampened. Aggression is thermodynamically unfavorable. Ilara stared at the human with awe and terror. You didn't defeat them. You changed the rules of the universe around them so they couldn't exist. We are not warriors, matriarch, Thorn said, walking back to his chair and slumping into it. We are gardeners, and sometimes you have to change the soil to kill the weeds. The revelation struck the alien. Delegates with the force of a religious experience. The humans weren't hiding. They weren't cowards. They were masters of a branch of physics so advanced it looked like magic. They had turned their entire solar system into a null-entropy zone, a place where the chaotic energies of war simply couldn't ignite. They were unconcerned by the war because the war literally could not function in their presence. The fleet is disabled, Zalker whispered. Ours and theirs, we are trapped here. For now, Thorn said, the field requires immense focus to maintain at this scale. We cannot hold the whole galaxy in stasis. We can only hold the door. The door, Ilara asked. Thorn gestured to the frozen devourer fleet. They are not just eating you, they are running. Did you never ask what they were running from? The blood drained from Zalker's face. Running, they are the apex predators. There is always a bigger fish, Thorn murmured. The devourers are fleeing a rupture in the galactic rim. Something is entering our galaxy, something that thrives on the very noise you create. The devourers are trying to consume enough biomass to build a wall, a shield against the invader. They are a panic reaction, a misguided attempt by the ecosystem to protect itself. Thorn leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Zalker. We have been sitting quietly, counselors, because we are the ones listening for the footsteps of the real enemy. We are the listeners at the gate. And your war, your noisy, messy, childish war, it is ringing the dinner bell. The room was silent. The petty politics of the Concordat, the borders, the trade disputes, all of it seemed infinitely small. What do we do? Zalker asked, his voice humble for the first time in his life. If our weapons are useless, if our war is suicide, how do we survive? Thorn stood up again. The playfulness was gone. He looked like a general now, a commander of a war that was fought not with bullets but with willpower. You stop the fighting, you stop the expansion, you dismantle the warp gates that tear the sky, you join the silence, you integrate your fleets into our network. We can extend the field, we can expand the quiet zone to cover the core worlds, but only if you stop screaming. It will mean the end of our economy, a trade delegate protested weakly. The end of our culture. It will mean the beginning of your maturity, Thorn countered. You have spent your infancy breaking things to see how they work. Now it is time to sit still and listen. The debate that followed was short. The evidence was floating in the sky above them. The Concordat fleets were dead in the water, the Devourers were neutralized, and the humans held the switch. Zalker rose, his warrior pride broken, but his survival instinct sharper than ever. We will submit. We will silence the guns. We will ground the fleets. Teach us the quiet. Thorn nodded. Good, because we are going to need every ounce of focus we can muster. Act 3 began not with a battle, but with a transformation. The humans didn't just share technology, they shared a philosophy. Teams of Terran engineers, accompanied by monks, specialists in the psionic physics dampening fields, boarded the Concordat ships. They installed the silence drivers. They taught the alien crews how to lower their output, how to synchronize their ship signals to the harmonic resonance of the background universe. It wasn't easy. It required a complete restructuring of alien societies. The Vrak had to learn that strength was not aggression. The Authari had to learn that profit was not worth entropy. Slowly, the red zones on the galactic map began to turn blue. As the Concordat worlds powered down their heavy industries and ceased their subspace communications, the Devourers lost their targets. Without the scent of high-energy chaos, the swarm became confused. They turned on each other or drifted aimlessly into the void, starving in the silence. The humans orchestrated the cleanup, not with fleets of destroyers, but with sweepers that simply deconstructed the biological matter of the enemy ships, returning the biomass to the planets they had ravaged. But the tension remained. Thorn had spoken of a real enemy, a threat that the Devourers were fleeing. 6 months after the Great Silence began, the signal came. It originated from the galactic rim, from the dark space beyond the spiral arms. It wasn't a radio signal. It was a thud, a singular, massive gravitational impact that shook the sensors of every ship in the new alliance. It was the sound of a footstep. The High Synod, now reconvened on Earth in the Grand Obsidium, which had been transported and reassembled in a Swiss valley, watched the telemetry. It is here, Thorn said. He looked older. The strain of maintaining the expanded silence field was taking its toll on the human population. They were the anchors, the psionic stabilizers for the technology. What is it? Alara asked feely, a coldness in her mind that froze her soul. The discordant note, Thorn replied. The antilogic, the Devourers consume matter. This thing, it consumes meaning. The view screen showed the edge of the galaxy. The stars were not just going out, they were being wrong. Their light was twisting, turning into colors that shouldn't exist, geometries that hurt the eyes to look at. A rift was opening, a wound in reality where the laws of physics were being rewritten into madness. It hears us, Zalker whispered, even in the silence. It hears the potential for noise, Thorn said. It is curious, but we are ready. Thorn turned to the assembly. The Vrak, the Authari, the humans, all the species of the galaxy standing together. We cannot defeat it with plasma. We cannot defeat it with hate. We must deny it a foothold. We must become a wall of absolute reality. We are going to synchronize the minds of 3 trillion sentients. We are going to think one thought, one absolute, undeniable truth. We are going to tell the universe, we are here and we do not move. The plan was madness. It was the ultimate HFY moment, but inverted. Instead of a display of overwhelming firepower, it was a display of overwhelming willpower. The humans linked the neural networks of the Alliance. They created a Gestalt consciousness, a single mental entity composed of every living being in the civilized galaxy. And at the center of it, the anchor, was humanity, the species that had practiced sitting in the dark, the species that had learned to face the void without blinking. The entity from the rim pushed against the galaxy. It tried to unravel the laws of gravity, to turn time backwards, to make up is down and life is death. It battered against the mental shields of the Alliance. The aliens wavered. The Vrak wanted to fight, their aggression nearly broke the link. The Athari wanted to bargain, their greed nearly opened a crack. But the humans held. They sat in their chairs, in their homes, in their council rooms, and they projected a wave of calm, stubborn, illogical refusal. No. The thought resonated across the stars. You may not enter, this is a quiet place. The entity shrieked, a psychic sound that shattered moons on the outer rim. It clawed at the barrier of the silence. But the barrier was made of the stubbornness of a species that would spite the gods just to prove a point. The humans didn't panic. They didn't flee. They poured their tea, they held their loved ones, and they looked into the abyss and said, "You are boring, go away." The banality of human resilience was the weapon. The entity thrived on drama, on fear, on chaos. It found no purchase on a galaxy that refused to give it a reaction. It was like a hurricane hitting a mountain of solid lead. It raged, it blew, and eventually it ran out of energy. The rift closed, the colors corrected themselves, the stars returned to their normal spectra, the footstep retreated back into the dark. In the council chamber on Earth, the link was severed. 3 trillion beings gasped for breath simultaneously. Zalker slumped against the table, weeping openly. Alara looked at Thorn with a reverence reserved for divinities. "It is gone," she whispered. Thorn took a sip of his cold tea. He looked incredibly tired, but he smiled. "For now, it will try again in another epoch, but we will be here." "You saved us," Zalker said, "by doing nothing." "We did the hardest thing of all, High Counselor," Thorn corrected. "We held our ground, we kept our peace." The aftermath was a galaxy forever changed. The wars did not return. The memory of the entity and the feeling of the unity during the Great Silence was too profound to forget. The fleets were permanently dismantled, converted into exploration vessels and colony ships. The Terran Union opened its borders not as conquerors, but as teachers. They taught the galaxy the art of the tea ceremony, the philosophy of stoicism, and the science of the stillness field. The story ends with a scene years later. Zalker, now retired, sits on a terrace overlooking a Vrak colony world that is green and lush, no longer a factory of war. He is sitting across from Thorn. They are playing a game of chess, an ancient human game of strategy. "You know," Zalker mused, moving a knight, "the galaxy still fears you. They say the humans are dangerous because they can turn off the universe." Thorn smiled, moving a pawn forward 1 square. "Let them fear the silence. It keeps the noise down." "But tell me, Silas," Zalker asked, looking up at the stars, which were peaceful and steady. "If the entity had broken through, if the silence had failed, did you have a backup plan? Did you have a weapon hidden away?" Thorn paused. He looked at the board, then at his old friend. For a split second, the mask of the weary philosopher slipped, and Zalker saw the glint of the apex predator that lay dormant in the human soul, the part of them that had conquered Earth, that had survived the ice ages, that had invented the atomic bomb before they invented spaceflight. "Zalker," Thorn said softly, his voice dropping to a register that sent a primal shiver down the alien's spine. "We are the species that sits quietly. We do this to protect the galaxy." "From the entity?" "No," Thorn said, checkmating the king with a gentle tap of his piece. "From us, if we ever have to stand up, God help you all." The camera pans out, leaving the 2 friends in the garden, rising up through the atmosphere, past the silent, guardian ships of the Terran Union, past the blue jewel of the planet, and out into the vast, quiet, terrifyingly safe galaxy, where the peace is held by the monsters who learn to sit still.